and welcome to Part 3 of the HUD Office of Public and Indian Housing Training on the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013, or a VAWA for short. Again, I'm Ryan Jones, a Senior Housing Program Specialist in the PIH Voucher Management Operations Division, and I continue to be joined by my colleague Miranda Stern, a Housing Program Specialist in PIH's Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division. In this part, we'll discuss emergency transfers, family breakup, record-keeping requirements, and developing partnerships with victim service providers. As a reminder, the material discussed in this training may be found in Notice PIH 2017-8, specifically sections 12 through 15. Our first topic in this part of the training is emergency transfers. The VAWA final rule requires PHAs to adopt an emergency transfer plan based on HUD's Model Emergency Transfer Plan. The form number is 5381, and the model plan may be downloaded at HUD Clips. Owners of assisted housing or the Housing Choice Voucher Program, including project-based vouchers, properties that are not PHAs or considered PHA-owned, are not the covered housing provider under this provision, and therefore are not required to adopt an emergency transfer plan. If an owner receives a request for an emergency transfer, the owner is encouraged to explain to the victim that the PHA is the covered housing provider for this activity, and that the PHA should be contacted directly. Per the final rule, PHAs must adopt an emergency transfer plan no later than June 14, 2017. PHAs administering public housing, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, including project-based vouchers, and Section 8 Mod Rehab, must ensure that their emergency transfer plan covers these programs. Let's start this discussion with what the emergency transfer plan must do. The plan must define tenants or participants eligible for an emergency transfer, list the documentation needed to request the emergency transfer, outline confidentiality protections, describe how an emergency transfer may occur, and at the PHA's discretion, the emergency transfer plan may require documentation, which should be listed. If a PHA is going to require documentation, only the documentation specified at 24 CFR 5.2005 E10 may be required. The emergency transfer plan must allow tenants who are victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking to make an internal emergency transfer under VAWA when a safe unit is immediately available. It is the victim who makes the safety determination. So what does that mean? Well, the VAWA final rule does not define immediately available. The VAWA notice says a best practice would be to define immediately available as a vacant unit ready for a move-in with a reasonable period of time as defined by the PHA. Emergency transfer plan, where the PHA also defines reasonable period of time based on local factors. To be more effective, HUD encourages PHAs to engage the victim in a conversation as to what they may consider safe or what factors the victim considers unsafe when they have requested an emergency transfer. This may allow the PHA to better tailor its emergency transfer response where it has the flexibility and resources to do so. The next requirement is that the emergency transfer plan must describe policies for assisting a tenant in making an internal emergency transfer when a safe unit is not immediately available, and describe reasonable efforts the PHA will take to assist a tenant who wishes to make an external emergency transfer when a unit that meets the victim's safety standard is not available. The emergency transfer plan must also incorporate strict confidentiality measures. In developing an emergency transfer plan, PHAs are encouraged to review their admissions and transfer policies to determine if revisions are necessary to facilitate emergency transfers. In determining whether changes to existing policies are necessary, PHAs may want to consider the following: the availability and location of units administered by the PHA, demand by applicants for assistance under the program, frequency of mandatory or emergency transfers, and availability of alternative housing opportunities. Before we get into eligibility for emergency transfers and the request process, let's spend a few moments on Model Form 5381 provided by HUD. You'll notice on the slide in the form that there are instances of references to a housing provider or HP. This is where the PHA would put its name. There's also language that is program dependent. What I mean by that is that the language was written to be as applicable as possible to most of HUD's programs, but it might not work for all programs, or at the very least might need to be modified slightly. For example, references to dwelling units and the availability of dwelling units doesn't work when you're talking about tenant-based rental assistance, because the assistance is with the family and not the unit. In this case, it's the ability to move with a voucher. If you're talking about public housing program, language about having another unit works. As you can tell from this brief discussion, the emergency transfer requirement works different depending on the subsidy type, and this sentence is an example where PHA will need to tailor the language to meet the specific program or programs it administers. We'll talk about the Housing Choice Voucher Program in just a moment. So I just talked about one of the areas a PHA will want to look to determine the appropriateness of language depending on the program to be covered. Now let's discuss where a PHA would not be making changes. For example, eligibility for an emergency transfer. While we'll discuss those requirements in just a moment, this is an area where the requirements of eligibility are very specific and codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. PHAs must not make changes to the eligibility requirements for an emergency transfer, just like the PHA can't require documentation beyond that in the federal regulations. So to recap, the model plan specifically calls out areas for housing providers to make edits, in our case the PHA. There are areas where the model plan will need to be amended to reflect covered program, and there are areas that will need to be added that speaks to the PHA specific protections being offered, and then there are areas where no changes will be made. So now let's step back to the programmatic requirements. To qualify for an emergency transfer, the tenant or participant must be receiving rental assistance through or residing in a unit subsidized under a covered housing program who is a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. For the purpose of this training, we are speaking about participants in the public housing or housing choice voucher programs. The tenant or participant must expressly request the transfer, and either the tenant or participant reasonably believes that there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if the tenant remains within the same dwelling unit, or, in the case of sexual assault, the tenant reasonably believes there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if the tenant remains with the same dwelling unit that the tenant is currently occupying, or the sexual assault occurred on the premise during the 90-day period preceding the date of the request for transfer. Just in case anyone missed it, it is a critical component of the requirement I just stated is the tenant or participant reasonably believes. VAWA is not asking others to come to that same determination, instead keeping the determination with the person best able to make it, the victim. The PHA's emergency transfer plan must indicate how a tenant or participant requests an emergency transfer. A PHA may either allow for a verbal self-certification or require a written request before any transfer occurs. A PHA should include in its emergency transfer plan and related VAWA policies whether verbal self-certification is sufficient to initiate an emergency transfer. The verbal self-certification, if permitted, or written request must include the eligibility requirements we just discussed, being a statement that the tenant requests an emergency transfer because the tenant or participant reasonably believes there is a threat of imminent harm from further violence if the tenant were to remain in the dwelling unit assisted under the PHA, or a statement that the tenant requests an emergency transfer because the tenant was a sexual assault victim and the sexual assault occurred on the premise during the 90-day period preceding the tenant's request for an emergency transfer. HUD created a model emergency transfer request document that PHAs requiring written requests for an emergency transfer may use. It's called Form HUD 5383. PHAs using the emergency transfer request document must make it available to the tenant or participant. HUD's model emergency transfer request document is available at HUD Clips. Because this is a new document, let's unpack it a little. The form starts with describing the purpose and is directed to the victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking that are seeking an emergency transfer. The form explains that a victim may submit the form to request an emergency transfer and certify that the requirements of an emergency transfer are met. The form clarifies that VAWA rights and protections apply to all victims and not just women. The form states that the submission of the form does not necessarily mean that the person requesting an emergency transfer will receive one. Finally, the form refers to the victim's housing provider's emergency transfer plan. A PHA may want to insert its name in place of housing provider and provide a link to or other instructions for accessing the PHA's emergency transfer plan. The form then goes on to explain the requirements for eligibility that we covered previously. The eligibility requirements should not be changed as these are based in statute and regulation. The form says that if a victim has third-party documentation that demonstrates why they are eligible for an emergency transfer, that they should submit that documentation if it is safe to do so. A PHA may request in writing that the victim provide documentation of an occurrence of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking in accordance with the regulations at 24 CFR 5.2007. In reference to the form saying that if the victim has third-party documentation that demonstrates why they are eligible for an emergency transfer, that they should submit it. The term should is not read as a must. Submitting third-party documentation is not a requirement for eligibility of an emergency transfer. After the confidentiality provisions, there's a heading that reads, to be completed by or on behalf of the person requesting a transfer. The form requires that the victim or person completing the form on their behalf answer 11 numbered questions and provides the option to list any third-party documentation that may be voluntarily submitted. The form clarifies that the name of the accused perpetrator does not have to be provided if it is unknown to the victim, or it cannot be provided safely as determined by the victim, and it requires certification to the truth and accuracy of the information being provided and explains that false information could be the basis for denial of admission, termination of assistance, or eviction. The form may be signed by the victim who is named on the form or the person completed on behalf of the victim.
Ryan, thank you for providing a foundation on emergency transfers. I will now discuss emergency transfer policies for the public housing program. PHAs have policies for both internal and external emergency transfers, and these policies must be included in the emergency transfer plan. PHAs have discretion to establish policies for treating transfer requests by a tenant and transfers that may be determined to be mandatory by the PHA. PHAs may categorize these transfer types in ways that allow them to prioritize or otherwise make determinations about the urgency of a transfer. The VAWA final rule did not change PHA authority to establish and define other transfer policies. It only requires that new policies be established for transfers under VAWA. So, all PHAs administering public housing must have policies for emergency transfers under VAWA. I just mentioned two types of emergency transfers, internal and external. So, what is an internal emergency transfer? It's a move of a tenant to another unit assisted under the same program where the tenant would not be categorized as a new applicant. In the case of public housing, this means a move from one public housing unit to another public housing unit under the same PHA's portfolio of units. The emergency transfer plan must allow a tenant to make an emergency transfer under VAWA when a safe unit is immediately available. The plan must describe policies for assisting tenants when a safe unit is not immediately available. Those policies must ensure that requests for internal emergency transfers under VAWA receive, at a minimum, any applicable additional priority that housing providers may already provide to other types of emergency transfer requests. We've defined an internal emergency transfer. So let's now discuss what an external emergency transfer is. An external emergency transfer refers to an emergency transfer of a tenant to another unit or form of assistance where the tenant would be categorized as a new applicant. For example, a move from a public housing unit owned by one PHA to a public housing unit owned by another PHA. So, do you see the distinction? In the first example, the tenant is transferred from one public housing unit to another under the same PHA. In the second example, there is a transfer between PHAs. The emergency transfer plan must describe reasonable efforts the PHA will take to assist a tenant who wishes to make an external emergency transfer when a safe unit is not immediately available. The emergency transfer plan must include policies for assisting a tenant who is seeking an external emergency transfer under VAWA out of the public housing program or unit, and a tenant who is seeking an external emergency transfer under VAWA into the public housing program or unit. A tenant must be allowed to seek an external and an internal emergency transfer concurrently when an internal safe unit is not immediately available. For example, if a PHA owns one public housing building and there are no vacancies in the foreseeable future, a victim may want to seek an internal and external emergency transfer concurrently, as there is no unit immediately available. In this instance, a PHA may decide to provide the victim a voucher if they have one available, or make other referrals as described in their emergency transfer plan. So what are some considerations a PHA should make when creating an external emergency transfer policies? Remember, these policies should be included and explained in a PHA's emergency transfer plan. Here are some considerations. A PHA may adopt an expedited application process with other covered housing providers, which may include with written consent of the victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, procedures which would allow the PHA to accept and use the prior covered housing provider's determination of eligibility and tenant screening, and all related verification information, including Form HUD 50058. Creation of an admissions preference for victims seeking an external emergency transfer from another VAWA covered housing provider, which would allow a victim to quickly access an available unit under a program administered by the PHA without being placed on the bottom of an applicant waiting list. Section 19 in the guidance will also provide additional guidance on adopting an admissions preference. Ryan, can you speak to the emergency transfer requirements as they apply to the Housing Choice Voucher program?
Sure thing. First, HUD encourages PHAs to detail in their emergency transfer plan not only how vouchers will be provided to the Housing Choice Voucher participants seeking emergency transfers under VAWA, but also what transfers or referral options may be available if the family needs a temporary place to stay while conducting their housing search for a new unit to lease under the Housing Choice Voucher program. There's a reason that there is less said about emergency transfers in the regulation for the Housing Choice Voucher program, because there are features of the program already in place that may be used by participants to move from their current unit to another unit that may provide the victim safety. For example, moving with continued assistance and portability. On the slide, I've included considerations when creating policies for participants with tenant-based assistance, including expediting programmatic activities for victims, and references to Housing Choice Voucher policies already available or enhanced to strengthen the safety of voucher participants that are victims. Because owners receiving HAP on behalf of an HCV participant in the project-based voucher program are not required to establish an emergency transfer plan, it is the PHA that must have emergency transfer policies for PBV participants. So, the PBV side of things works a little different. Here, Like in public housing, the assistance is tied to the unit. But unlike in public housing, the PBV program already has in place requirements providing a voucher to allow a family to move. In the case of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, resulting in an emergency transfer request, the PHA must give the victim priority to receive the next availability for continued tenant-based assistance. Note that this feature is only required after the first year of residence. Also note that the programmatic requirements to provide advanced written notice does not apply in these circumstances. PHAs must include in their emergency transfer plan policies for when the victim has been living in a PBV unit for less than 1 year. This is because the requirement that the PHA offer the family the opportunity for continued tenant-based rental assistance applies only when the family terminates the assistance leased after the first year of occupancy. This requirement does not apply to families within the first year of the lease. PHAs may have a policy to provide continued tenant-based rental assistance to the victims making emergency transfer requests that have lived in a PBV unit for less than 1 year. Such families must be selected off the waiting list for the applicable program. Like public housing residents, participants in the Housing Choice Voucher program may need to move to protect their health or safety. In recognition of these safety needs, the VAWA final rule provides several exceptions for such victims to enable them to move with continued assistance in the tenant-based voucher program. First, the PHA's policies on restricting timing and number of moves do not apply when the family or a member of the family is or has been the victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and the move is needed to protect the health or safety of the family or family member. Second, a PHA may not terminate assistance if the family, with or without prior notification to the PHA, has already moved out of a unit in violation of a lease. If such a move occurred to protect the health or safety of a family member who is or has been a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and who reasonably believed they were imminently threatened by harm from further violence if they remained in the dwelling unit, or if any family member has been the victim of sexual assault that occurred on the premise during the 90-day calendar period preceding the family's request to move. Miranda, what does this look like in public housing?
Thanks, Ryan. As the emergency transfer element is new to the VAWA final rule, we will go over several examples starting with public housing. We'll spend a little more time on this example where the steps are the same without regard to assistance type. In this example, a tenant informs a PHA that they are a victim of dating violence and fearful of further violence. The household consists of a victim, who is the head of household, and 2 children under the age of 18. If requested to do so, the PHA provides the victim with the PHA's VAWA Notice of Occupancy Rights. If the victim doesn't request the notification of rights and hasn't been provided the notice, the PHA provides it to the victim. The PHA exercises its discretion to accept a verbal statement from the victim or request documentation. The documentation or verbal statement is accepted. We have as step 4 that the victim informs the PHA that they are seeking an emergency transfer. Keep in mind, this may have been requested when the victim first reached out to the PHA. We put it here to make it easier to see the activities broken out. The victim certifies that they meet the requirements for an emergency transfer. The PHA can decide to accept the victim's statement or request a written request for an emergency transfer. The PHA accepts the written request assuming that it had been requested provided via the criteria specified in 24 CFR 5.2005E10 or in a verbal statement. In step 7, the PHA refers to their emergency transfer plan to work with the victim and inform them of their options. They go over their options, starting with an internal emergency transfer, in which the PHA offers to put the victim on an internal emergency transfer waiting list. However, a safe unit is not immediately available within a reasonable time period. Because a safe unit is not immediately available, the PHA also explains external emergency transfer opportunities. The external emergency transfer option is the PHA offers to place the victim in the applicant list for their HCV program. But a voucher is not immediately available either, so the PHA provides the victim with a list of housing providers in the community for which the PHA has partnered to serve victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. The PHA informs the victim that a local victim service provider may be able to assist them with identifying temporary shelter along with resources such as safety planning, counseling, and emergency funding. The PHA provides the victim with contact information. We're at step 9 now. The victim decides to stay in the current public housing unit until they are able to secure a voucher or another public housing unit. Although not required under the VAWA final rule, the PHA takes steps to reduce the threat of further violence against the victim, changing the victim's locks, installing better lighting around the perimeter of the building, and reminding the victim that they are allowed temporary absence from the unit in accordance with their PHA policy. Then, a public housing unit becomes available. The PHA notifies the victim of the availability of the unit and provides a tour of the unit. The victim determines the unit to be safe. The PHA quickly follows its policies for a move, and a service provider funds the move of the victim's belongings. Ryan, will you go over 2 more examples in both the HCV and PVV programs?
Sure. Like we just did for the public housing program, let's review the examples provided in the notice on the emergency transfers in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. For those following along in the notice, this is an example located in section 12.7. In this scenario, we have a victim of domestic violence, and the victim and perpetrator are co-head members of the household. If the first steps in this example look familiar to the public housing example Miranda just went through, it is because they are similar. The subsidy type does not change those steps. Again, steps 4 through 6 are going to be similar across the programs. It's at step 7 that the example becomes program and fact specific. Unlike in the public housing program, the concept of an internal and an external emergency transfer does not exist. In this case, we have a co-head members of the family that are victim and perpetrator respectively. As a result, the PHA's family breakup policy comes into play. When the family breakup is a result of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, the PHA ensures that the victim retains assistance. The last bullet mentions a discretionary policy that the PHA may adopt. That is, the adoption of a policy to provide a voucher to facilitate the emergency transfer without having first terminated assistance to the perpetrator. The idea here is to expedite the protections for the victim so that they do not have to wait on additional administrative processes. Step 8 is something HUD included in each of the emergency transfer examples. It is a best practice to provide contact information to the victim so they may receive help identifying temporary shelter or other resources that may help them in this time of crisis. In this example, the PHA issues a voucher to the victim per its policies without having first taken actions to terminate assistance of the perpetrator. If the PHA did not have this policy, it would first follow its normal family breakup policies prior to issuing a voucher to the victim. Step 10 notes that if the assistance to the family is terminated, the HAP contract is automatically terminated. When the HAP contract is terminated, the lease is automatically terminated. This provision is included in the tenancy addendum, Form HUD 52641A. The example concludes with the victim identifying a safe home and the PHA doing what it can to expedite any related administrative steps. So we've talked about emergency transfers in public housing and for participants with a tenant-based voucher. Now let's discuss an emergency transfer within the project-based voucher program. We're now at section 12.8 of the notice. Here, we have a victim of stalking that is fearful for their safety if they remain in their current home. The victim is the head of household and has lived in the unit for more than 1 year. Again, initial steps are the same. It is at step 7 where the process is program specific. In this example, the victim has lived in the unit for more than 1 year. As a result, the victim may exercise the right to move under the PPV program. Although they have lived in their unit for more than 1 year, a voucher is not currently available. The PHA may, again, this is dependent on the PHA policies, offer to allow the tenant to move to another PPV unit, place the victim on their public housing waiting list if they have a public housing program, or provide community connections. As a best practice, this PHA worked with 2 neighboring PHAs to develop a waiting list preference for victims seeking an emergency transfer. And like the other case, the PHA informs the victim of available supports. In this example, there's a domestic violence shelter with available space. The victim moves from their current home for safety of the shelter. The victim notifies the owner that they have moved and that it is a result of domestic violence by another member of the household. A voucher is still not available. In this example, as a result of the partnerships, the victim is able to receive assistance through another PHA that has an available unit. The victim determines that the unit is safe. Remember, it is the victim that is the person that makes this determination, and the victim moves. Passing over to Miranda to discuss family breakups.
Thanks, Ryan. The occurrence of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking may lead to the breakup of the assisted family in many instances. Like the emergency transfer requirements, the notice and this training provides program-specific scenarios which are fact-intensive. Remember that real-world cases of victims seeking VAWA protections must be approached in a way that takes into consideration the specifics of each case and addressed pursuant to the program requirements and PHA policy. In this public housing scenario, we have a situation of domestic violence within the household, and the victim is seeking to have the perpetrator removed while retaining assistance. The victim may choose to inform the PHA of the abuse after the PHA has notified the household that they are being evicted, for example, due to criminal activity, or at any other point. So, again, just as the emergency transfer scenarios, there is a consideration of the provision of the notice of occupancy rights, acceptance of a verbal statement, or request for documents. Now let's break down what is happening at step 3. To remove the perpetrator, the PHA is following the requirements and policies for evicting the perpetrator. HUD is strongly encouraging the PHA to ensure that the victim knows of the upcoming notification of eviction of the perpetrator, and like in the emergency transfer scenarios, hopefully providing contact information for possible assistance. For example, the opportunity to establish a safety plan, seek temporary shelter, all in the name of victim safety. In step 4, we have the PHA beginning the process to evict the perpetrator as a result of a threat to other residents. This is where victim choice and eligibility for an emergency transfer come into play. The victim may want to seek an emergency transfer. The victim could also want to stay and wait out the eviction of the perpetrator. Now, for an important note, to protect the victim's safety, any information that would reveal the location of the victim or the location of services that the victim is receiving must be maintained in confidentiality. The PHA provides the perpetrator notice of termination and, if requested, a grievance hearing. It should be noted that the perpetrator has the right to examine the PHA's documentation relevant to the eviction. Now for another important note. To protect the victim's safety, any information that would reveal the location of the victim or the location of any services that the victim is receiving must be maintained in confidentiality. The hearing officer or hearing panel provides the perpetrator with a written decision if it is determined that the perpetrator did indeed commit the acts. Then the case will be moved to the eviction court. Ryan?
Thank you. Like we did with emergency transfers, let's now discuss how the policy, in this case family breakup, is applied in the tenant-based side of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. In this scenario, we have a victim and perpetrator in the same household. Step 1 and Step 2 are the same as in the public housing example. That is, the provision of notice of occupancy rights and acceptance of a statement or request for documentation. Step 3 does not change. But step 4 does change. The PHA begins the process to terminate the perpetrator for violation of a family obligation as a result of crime by household members, which is provided for at 24 CFR 982-551. In step 5, the PHA provides the perpetrator prompt written notice of termination. If the perpetrator requests an informal hearing, the PHA must proceed with the hearing in a reasonably expeditious manner. Like Miranda said, the perpetrator has a right to examine the PHA documentation directly relevant to the hearing. The PHA may disclose documentation submitted by the victim, but the PHA must remove or otherwise withhold information that may place the victim at risk of further violence. Again, for example, if the victim has secured a temporary living situation and the location is included in the documentation, the PHA must remove or otherwise hide this information. Continuing with step 5, HUD recommends that PHAs consult a local domestic violence expert or a victim service provider that has not worked with either the victim or the perpetrator to be on the informal hearing panel. Moving on to step 6. If the victim wishes to move, the PHA is encouraged to assist the victim in negotiating a mutual rescission of the lease if needed. If the victim moves out of the unit in violation of the lease in order to protect the health or safety of the victim, the PHA must allow the victim in the tenant-based voucher program to move with continued tenant-based assistance. As mentioned previously, termination of the HAP for the family results in the termination of the lease. We've had a few questions about treating family breakup as a result of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking for HUD VASH families where the veteran is the perpetrator of the violence. If you've done an internet search on this subject before, you probably found an old FAQ on this subject. So the VAWA policies are in one place. We described HUD policies for HUD VASH and VAWA in section 13.3 of the notice. In the case of HUD VASH, just like with regular voucher program, the victim must continue to be assisted. When the perpetrator's HUD VASH voucher is terminated, the victim should be given a regular housing choice voucher. In this case, the HUD VASH voucher would go to serve another veteran. If a regular voucher is not available, the perpetrator is terminated from assistance and the victim continues to utilize the HUD VASH voucher. Upon turnover, the voucher must be issued to another eligible family. Now, let's take a look at record keeping and recording requirements.
Thanks, Ryan. The VAWA final rule includes a requirement for PHAs to keep confidential records of all emergency transfers requested under its emergency transfer plan and the outcomes of such. These records are to be kept for 3 years. The final rule also included an annual reporting requirement. HUD will communicate details about the reporting keeping requirement at a later date. Until then, PHAs are not required to report this information to HUD. It would of course be beneficial for PHAs to maintain this information to facilitate future reporting to HUD. HUD encourages ongoing efforts for PHAs to strengthen access to supportive services for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. PHAs who have been successful in this have developed valuable relationships with domestic violence, victim advocates, legal aid services, and law enforcement agencies to ensure that victims are getting the necessary supportive services they need. These relationships have increased PHA awareness of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Most importantly, these efforts have saved lives and resulted in victims accessing critical supportive services to rebuild their lives. HUD also encourages PHAs to share best practices. Such practices include participating in regular domestic violence working groups with domestic violence victim advocates, legal aid services, and law enforcement agencies, inviting domestic violence victim advocates to speak, providing easy-to-access, easy-to-understand information pamphlets, facilitating counseling and support groups, working with domestic violence victim advocates to make policy changes, and establishing tenant admission preferences to prioritize victims, including victims referred to the local continuum of care. These may be helpful in assisting a PHA to identify local domestic violence experts who would participate in grievance hearings, informal hearings, or other informal reviews. You can find more information at justice.gov/OVW, where the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women maintains resources that may be of assistance to communities seeking to learn about domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. That concludes Part 3 of the training. Please stay tuned for Part 4.